Hey everybody, it's Nicole Dice with Avelion Studios, back again with another video. And today's video, I kind of wanted to show you guys the process I use when I paint watercolor portraits. So a couple weeks ago, I asked my followers on Facebook and Instagram to submit selfies for me to paint. And these are the first two in a series that I'm doing of videos of selfies that I've painted for people. So when I start, I kind of do a loose sketch of the person to start off. I did freehand sketches this time versus the grid method. If you're new to sketching portraits, you might want to start off with the grid method just to get more accuracy, but if you draw portraits more often, you can go ahead and break their face down into shapes and sections to help you kind of proportion out where everything is. After that, I've mixed some skin tones, and I do this by starting with, I think it's called raw sienna, and then I mix in white and a little bit of blue and different shades of colors to kind of match their skin tone. And then I just go ahead and start off with a light wash of water over the area that I'll be painting, and I start to kind of flesh out the skin a little bit. Now, I do like the wet on wet method of watercolor the best, because it's smoother. So I feel when I'm doing skin tones, I will go ahead and prep the area first with just clean water, and then I will go ahead and put a little wash of color over top and build layers from there. Now, it is important that you're not putting too much water onto the paper at once, because then you're just going to end up with a mushy mess of paper or pilling on the paper. The other issue is that if you're using thinner watercolor paper, it will start to kind of bubble up and get a little messy, so you want to be careful you're not putting too much water. You're just kind of dampening the surface a little bit. You don't want to drown it in water. The paper that I'm using today is the Canson, I think it's 140 pound cold pressed paper. I like this one, especially for quick sketches. It's affordable and it does a pretty good job at holding up against all the water that we'll be putting on it. So now, as you can see, I kind of like to build the layers of color slowly. I'll add in different blushes, different tones to the skin where I see them. So the face and skin is not the same color over the entire area. There'll be areas of the face that have more blue tints, more orange tints, more kind of pinky rosy tints. I notice it tends to be a little bit more red around the nose, cheeks, and chin area, whereas the forehead tends to be more neutral. So as you are painting, you're going to want to kind of segment or separate some of your skin tone out so that you can be adding different tints to each version as you go, depending on what you need. And kind of building your layers. So I do tend to do wet on wet for the first few layers, and then I'll add in kind of the finishing touches using the wet on dry method. And obviously there's other ways you can do this in different styles and preferences depending on each artist, but this is kind of just the way that I like to kind of work out my skin tones and such. And it does end up being a lot smoother. I've noticed if you tend to do wet on dry, it can be a little streaky, and I notice it looks like a little bit, at least when I do it, a little bit rashy after, so I like to make sure that they're looking nice and smooth. Now, for the eyebrows, I've went ahead and mixed dark brown by using sienna and black together, and I like to use a nice thin brush when I'm adding in these tiny little details so that you're not accidentally painting outside of the area, and so you can get little fine hairs in the eyebrow, and it's easier to add in little details around the face with a tinier brush. Now, for large areas, you do want to use a bigger brush because it'll be smoother and it'll be faster, and we don't want to sit here all day just slowly painting our way through. So it can be scary sometimes to use big brushes, but I actually kind of prefer them, to be honest, unless I'm doing detail work, because they cover a lot more area faster and they kind of end up smoother. They'll hold more pigment as well. Now, speaking of brushes, you want to be picking brushes that have long bristles that are specific to watercolor so that they can actually hold a lot more water inside of the brush, and it'll drag your paint further, and it'll be easier to paint with watercolor brushes versus using regular acrylic or oil brushes when you're doing watercolor. So that'll make your life a lot easier. Now, I've also went ahead and I did cover certain areas of the painting with masking fluid prior to beginning to paint. I used the Liquitex clear masking fluid. I got it from Amazon. I think it was like $14. I'll leave a link down in the description. I really like this one. It doesn't smell as much as the other masking fluid because I know it has a particular scent to it. And it dries clear, and I really like it. It was really easy to pick off. I used like a little toothpick to kind of get certain areas off, but I've went ahead and I've covered highlights in the glasses and her jewelry and such with this masking fluid, and I really like it. But a thin layer is all you need when you're using it. You don't want to put too much because it'll start to actually peel the paper. So just a thin layer of it with a brush that you don't particularly like so much, because it will ruin your brush. It'll become your masking fluid brush. And that's all you really need, and I really liked that. Now, when I'm doing hair, I do like to kind of do one side of the head and let it dry so that I'm not smudging it with my hand when I go to paint the other side. So you'll see me kind of move to different areas of the portrait as the video progresses, because I'm waiting for other areas to dry. And for black hair, especially when you're doing dark color hairs, I like to leave a lot of highlights to make the hair look glossy, because it's really easy to want to just paint the whole thing in solid black and it's this flat tone. So you want to make sure you're looking at the different shadows and highlights, and you're not just solid painting something, just solid black. Now her sweater is fuzzy, so you'll see me kind of lay a base layer on right now of just a pale pink just to kind of fill in the color, and I will add more of a fur detail afterwards when the layer is dry. So if you're adding wet on wet constantly and you're trying to do little details, it's going to bleed into itself. So you have to make sure when you're adding details that you're letting your layers dry completely before you get in there with fine detail work, because it's going to just bleed into each other and look fuzzy. So if that's what you're going for, you can go ahead and use that as a technique. But if you want more crisp little details, you're going to want to make sure that you're leaving time in between for everything to dry, and so that they're not bleeding into each other. And I think that's like the biggest, I guess, rookie mistake when people first start doing watercolor, is they're not being patient with dry times. You got to really understand it's water we're working with, so water will bleed into each other, it transfers color, so you want to make sure that you're being patient with your watercolor. So here I am. See how easy that comes off? It kind of like peels right off. That was really satisfying to do. I kind of love peeling masking fluid. Let me know in the comments below if you kind of like doing that kind of stuff too. So I got all the little highlights off. I mean, you could technically go back with a white acrylic or like a gesso, and you could do all those little highlight details in with that, but I've left some areas white because I'm going to paint on them now with a detail brush, and some I've left as a highlight. So I just do find it easier to use masking fluid for those things. I feel like it comes really, really white. You don't have to worry about layering it, because sometimes the acrylic will activate the watercolor underneath a little bit and you'll see color transfer through, so you usually have to do a couple layers. So I find the masking fluid's probably the easiest way to achieve those bright highlights. Now, if you are going to use masking fluid, just make sure again that the area around it's completely dry before you start peeling it off, so that you don't have the watercolor bleeding into the area that you've just worked so hard to keep nice and white and crisp. So now switching over to my detail brush, I'm going ahead and adding little fuzzes on the sweater. I mean, like, I'm doing this more of like an impression, isn't exactly a realism piece, so I'm just adding a little bit of texture around the edges, not going too crazy with it. I mean, if you wanted to, you could really map out all that texture and go for it, but I'm just kind of doing this like an illustrative style of watercolor versus realism. And I think it's kind of fun and cute, and it just depends what you're kind of aiming for. And again, so now that the hair is completely dry, I'm going ahead and just adding little shadows, little details, stray hairs, and kind of sharpening up the image a little bit to add all those little final touches that'll make it look more finished. Adding some details on the cone here. And there you go. Before and after. Turned into a watercolor painting. So now we're also painting one of my friends from Facebook, and like the same techniques apply to male and female when you're doing portraits, and so do the proportions of the face. So when you are drawing out a portrait, I always like to start with a circle, and then from there I'll shape out the jawline and chin, and then you want to make sure that your eyes are positioned halfway between the top of the head and the chin, and that the nose is halfway between the eye line and the chin, and the mouth is halfway between the nose line and the chin. So every human face follows this proportion, male or female, and then obviously men usually have thicker necks, they have more pronounced jawlines, and those kind of subtle differences. But if you can understand the layout of a basic face, then you can pretty much draw any portrait. Now, he had a little bit more of a warm tone to his skin, so I took the skin colors I used to paint Sabrina on the left, and I went ahead and added a little bit more crimson in there and a little bit of orange to kind of warm up the skin tone a little bit. And then, as you can see, I'm using the same wet on wet method and kind of just adding in my details from there. And focusing on the different areas that I see are in shadow, focusing on the highlights of the face and the different colors I'm seeing throughout the face. So obviously, because I think this photo was taken in the summer, I think he got a little bit of sun. It's a bit more sun-kissed. You're going to notice a lot more red around the cheeks and nose area. And I've left the chin pretty much blank because he does have a beard, so I'm kind of leaving some space for that. Now, you could always go ahead and paint a skin tone underneath the facial hair if it's not a thick beard and you're noticing skin coming through. I see that mistake a lot where people kind of leave like eyebrows and chin blank, and then they paint hair on top, and you'll see the white areas in between, and it looks really awkward. So for eyebrows and facial hair, you always kind of want to put skin tone base underneath, because most people don't have just solid eyebrows or solid chin hair, and you're just going to be painting on this like black thing on their face. You're going to see skin through. So in order to keep it a little bit more natural, you want to make sure you have a base under there so that it doesn't look like they have like white stuff in their eyebrow. And I'm just going ahead, and you want to follow when you're doing portraits. You want to make sure you're capturing the little details of the face that kind of make them look like them and unique, like little beauty marks or highlights in their eyes, the way their eyebrows are. And so even if it isn't an exact photo replica, you're going to kind of capture the characteristics of that person, and that's what's going to make it a successful drawing. So for the beard, I chose to do it in 2 layers. So I did a base layer of a lighter brown, then I went ahead and kind of added some shadow and detail in with a darker brown afterwards, and I think it made it look a little bit more convincing than doing every single beard hair individually. Same thing with the eyebrows. I wanted to do a little base first, and then kind of add a secondary texture over top of that to make it more convincing. Now, eyes and are kind of like a defining facial feature, and you want to make sure you're getting those right. Now, more often than not, I'll see my students kind of drawing what they think something looks like versus actually looking at the photo and noticing little details in the portrait or whatever they're drawing. So you want to be constantly referencing your photograph or your photo reference. And secondly, I think a lot of people just kind of leave the eye whites really white in eyes, or they don't tend to outline men's eyes in darker browns, and you want to make sure you're looking at those little details. Like often the whites of the eyes have a lot of gray or yellow in them, and you want to be paying attention to that so that you're really capturing the look. And the second tip for watercolor for eyes is just do it in stages, because if you're doing the outline, you're doing the inside at the same time, like I said, it's going to bleed into each other and you're going to end up with a hot mess. It's going to be a mushy eye disaster everywhere. Now, something I do struggle with often is people who smile with their mouth open when I'm painting, because I feel like that's such a hard expression to capture. So I've been trying to kind of challenge myself with that more recently, to be drawing people with their mouths open, because teeth are so hard to get right. And obviously when you're drawing someone smiling, the teeth are not pure white. You're going to have grays, yellows, different tones within that as well. And it's kind of the perfect balance of making sure you're getting all the shades right versus making them look like they have dirty teeth or something like that. Now for clothing, again, I'd like to start with like a basic wash of a lighter version of the shirt. And then from there, I'll add in all my highlights and shadows. It's just less intimidating when you have a color down on the paper. For his shirt, he has little pineapples printed on it. I thought that was a fun print. I just did it more of an impression of the print versus a realistic exact take on it. I think that's something we do a lot in fashion. I do a lot of fashion illustration in my free time, and we tend to like to do little impressions of things versus exact details. I think it is more trendy now to have really realistic fashion illustration, but I always liked the kind of impression and texture of watercolor that leaves. So I like to kind of mix that into my illustrations a little bit. So just to leave little details here and there, it's kind of cute to not overly define your illustration. You got to know when things are finished as well. Like sometimes you overwork a drawing, you put too much detail and it starts to kind of lose that cool illustrative quality to it. And with realism, obviously, you're going to have to do that, but when you're wanting to make more of a illustrative style, like a semi-realism, you don't want to accidentally overdo it. And I also used masking fluid on his portrait as well, just to make sure his teeth stayed white until I was ready to start working with them. Because that's the worst when you're painting and you keep slowly going over areas and making them smaller by accident. So I like using the masking fluid as a little safeguard. And there's a before and after. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe and hit the bell if you like my content. I release new content every Friday.